Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan, and I'm an editor at Ahval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me today is Dr. Nora Fisher-Onar. She is a professor at the University of San Francisco and an expert on Turkey. Nora, pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So I wanted to invite you to talk about a recent survey that came out from the German Marshall Fund, U.S. and in collaboration with Bilgi University in Turkey, and it was talking about political polarization inside the country. And the survey points to a lot of division inside Turkey today, with really high levels of political polarization that, of course, we've seen that in many other countries, including in the US. But I want to ask you, Nora, how would you describe the long-term risks that accompany these high levels of distrust in and division in Turkish society today?
Sure. Well, as we know very well here in the United States as well, polarization is not unique to Turkey. It's a strategy that politicians can employ to generate passionate support among their followers. But unfortunately, as a strategy, it also makes it harder to govern, right? Because people get so impassioned about their positions that they find it harder and harder to compromise. So it kind of becomes a vicious cycle, and that you then have to polarize more in order to retain the support to govern, even if as it becomes harder and harder to actually do the work of governance. And so, this can become reach untenable levels. We saw this in the US Capitol yesterday. But the difference between the US and Turkey, of course, is that President Erdogan is a much more skilled political player than President Trump. And so he has actually managed to combine a polarizing strategy with gaining control of the state, its various branches. So the people who are the others in the discourse of the governing coalition, most notably sort of Kurds or non-Sunnis or sort of non-practicing, more kind of pro-secular Turks, they feel really alienated. And by far the highest levels of alienation are among Kurds. They're not trusted by other people. They don't trust others. They feel discriminated against in their daily lives. They have a higher desire to, this is all according to the survey results from this fantastic study that you invoke. And so they want to emigrate. And, this can lead to sort of real extreme embitterment, because if you feel like you're hopeless at home, and, if you can't go abroad, even if you want to, it can be, a really worrisome situation. And the other thing that was really troubling about the survey's findings, this is a survey led by Dr. Emre Erdoğan of Bilgi University and supported by Turquoise Lab. It's a really, really insightful set of data. Another thing that they found was that people in Turkey are increasingly coming to the point where they don't want to share social space with each other, and they don't want to share sort of the political space with each other. So they feel that 35 to I think 40% of respondents felt that other political supporters of other political parties shouldn't be allowed to organize rallies or meetings or engage in press releases, in their vicinity. 33% said that they shouldn't be allowed to participate in national or municipal elections, which is really worrisome. And 26% even said it was okay to tap supporters of other parties' phone lines for security reasons. So this is really upsetting for folks who study sort of peace and conflict management. Is a field. There's something called early warning signs when a society has the potential to kind of experience exacerbated conflict. And unfortunately, a lot of these signs seem to be present. There's a history of past conflict. There's very sort of acute articulated grievances and differences. There's not a lack of a framework for peaceful conflict resolution, but it's been abandoned for the time being. The country feels isolated, so it's for old friends of Turkey who love and respect the people of the country a great deal. It's a saddening tableau. I do have kind of a semi-optimistic thing to say about it though too. I don't know if I should hold that
Please,
off for later.
please.
Well, one thing that I think this is, maybe just kind of grasping for a silver lining. But one thing that I think has happened that we also experience here in the United States is when you have high levels of polarization, eventually people also get polarization fatigue. You get tired of being kind of constantly riled up and constantly feeling upset. And there was one really encouraging sign towards the end of last year. It's maybe just kind of a drop in the ocean, but there was a Netflix miniseries called Bir Başkadır, or Ethos is I think the name in English, and it's really an extremely sort of empathetic portrayal of people kind of trying to communicate with each other across identity lines, gender, class, ethnic and religious lines, and it's got huge reception in Turkey, really sort of widespread outpouring of interest and support. So it really speaks to kind of untapped resources potentially within the society, which is very dynamic society, very diverse society, in terms of a kind of a desire to actually overcome this polarization. But the question is how.
Hmm. Well, very often when the polarization subject comes up, they talk about the socioeconomic factors that feed into it, and the survey showed that there was a lot of focus on economic issues in Turkey, whether it's like the COVID-19 pandemic or regular Turkish families' ability to make ends meet, and this was even present with supporters in the ruling coalition with the AK party and their MHP coalition partner. So a lot of conventional analysis usually suggests that these kind of like levels of economic pessimism hurt the government in electorally. But do you think that the governments they've tended to still do well. They've been in power for over 20 years now. So do you think that this should cause some kind of rethink in how socioeconomic factors really do play out in politics in polarized countries?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The economy, the old adage, right? It's the economy is stupid.
Yeah.
And these survey results, really clearly show that absolutely the biggest worry for across the board for everyone in Turkey, irrespective of political party or kind of social, identity, is the economy. It's unemployment. There's double-digit inflation, and this has all been exacerbated by the pandemic, which is meaning that certain key sectors that are pillars of the economy, like tourism or the food and beverage industry, they're all suffering. And all of this kind of goes hand in hand with also the predicament that youth are facing in Turkey, with sort of increasing structural unemployment and a real sense that they don't have prospects. And so it's a distressing situation, but by the same token, it's one where there's clearly desire for amelioration, and it's the one that the government has the most incentive to deliver on in terms of economic governance, because that was always the AKP's calling card, was that the AKP was the one that lifted Turkey out of kind of its constant cycles of macroeconomic boom and bust, and ever since privatization in the 80s, and it was the AKP that lifted millions of Turks into the middle classes and above during the 2000s. That was kind of like the golden era of Turkey being a rising star in the G20, and so it has a track record of delivering on this front, and the challenge now is that those Turks who kind of remember and benefited from this boost in the 2000s, they're now middle-aged or older, and so it's kind of really key to securing support for the next generation to deliver on economic governance. There's some encouraging signs in terms of at the macroeconomic level, but it's hard to see until the pandemic is over how the economy can really be jump-started in a meaningful way that are going to help people right now struggling to put food on the table. It's clearly a grave concern, and yet Turkey has the economic capacity, the human capital, and until very recently had also the institutions and the habits of economic governance to be able to do this. So I'm not I don't despair that it can be delivered, but it certainly is probably item number one on the to-do list.
There's one particular point in the survey that I also found particularly interesting, and that was that the Turkish army is listed as the most trusted institute in society today, including among AKP supporters in particular. At the same time, a majority, it said that a majority of Turks single out the July 15th, 2016 coup attempt as the biggest single cause for division in the country. And another 78% who were surveyed said that they were concerned about another coup taking place. Would you say that the popularity of the military at the same time as heightened concerns about a coup today are different compared to other periods of time in Turkish history? What makes it different?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because it does present a bit of a puzzle, right? The military has been, for as long as I can remember, has been, traditionally the most trusted institution in Turkish society, much more than political parties or politicians, and that kind of ebbed a bit in the 2000s when the AKP was pursuing kind of an EU accession process that involved the commitment to civilization, and also, had engaged in dialogue on the Kurdish question and was engaged in a foreign policy at the time that was, described as pursuit of zero problems with neighbors. So there really was uh, maybe a period, a window in the earlier mid 2000s when there was the military might have been a little bit less front and center in terms of the positivity that people attributed to it, but especially after the 2016 coup attempt, there's been a sort of a self-conscious effort on the part of the ruling coalition to kind of reactivate that sense of loyalty to the military and to revitalize that sense that Turks are a military nation with heroism and a martial character kind of embedded in the DNA, and this has gone hand in hand in a period even preceding the attempted coup with renewed conflict with the PKK. So there is this kind of rally around the flag kind of dynamic that has been, explicitly couched and framed in the language of sort of Turks' intrinsic militarism that may have served to revamp support for the military as an institution. But when you look sort of broadly in the past, at least 75 years, periods where there's been less trust in the military have been the exception vis-a-vis periods when it has been the most trusted institution in Turkey. So it's kind of a return to the status quo ante, as it were.
And it's also just interesting to me to go back to how the AK party, their voters were surveyed with the highest opinion of the military. Yet, but there's still, of course, some sensitivity around the topic of coups, given Turkey's history with them. Since even just this week, we reported on an incident that came about when a retired Turkish general, a retired chief of the general staff, had tried to explain the 1960 coup attempt, and that got a lot of outrage from AKP members, including one who said that the CHP is the one always inviting a coup, and they're against coups unless it's in their favor. So, it seems like an interesting inverse in a way, considering most AKP supporters are actually more supportive, according to the survey, of the military than CHP or the opposition.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of what you said. And I would it's interesting that you raised the debate about the 1960 coup. And one other thing that came out in the survey that was really interesting was that supporters of different political parties in Turkey have sort of very different levels of salience when it comes to which historical episodes they remember as deeply problematic and which episodes they are more reconciled to in terms of the role that those experiences played in the unfolding story of the nation. So for example, the 1960 coup, the 1997 sort of, velvet gloved coup or postmodern coup against pro-religious civil society. These are events which are remembered really sort of, starkly by AKP supporters, whereas, for example, supporters in the various opposition parties are kind of much more attuned to more recent events. They have more, the markers for what the big controversial events are things that have happened during the period of AKP tenure since 2002. So it's an interesting dissonance there in terms of the salience of these different sort of dramatic historical events in the respective sort of collective memories of these different constituencies in Turkey. But again, I didn't entirely get your question because you were breaking up a bit there.
Well, you essentially answered my question. You caught the main gist that I wanted answered. So thank you for that.
Excellent.
The what I want to go over to is on foreign policy also, because Turks do seem pretty united in the idea of who their enemies are, who they perceive the enemy to be, and even the majority in the opposition parties believe it's the United States. As the U.S. and Turkey have had a rocky last few years from the end of Obama through Trump. What are the challenges that this view of America represents to you for President-elect Joe Biden, given his own kind of traditional foreign policy background and his own past critical remarks on Turkey and Erdogan in particular?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to register that ambivalence to the United States has been alive and well for a long time. Prior to Biden, prior to Trump, prior to Obama. It dates back at least to the 1970s when there was deep kind of concern at the way that President Johnson handled the U.S. response to the situation in Cyprus. There was very strong anti-American sentiment in the early 2000s at the time of the Bush administration, kind of raising a coalition for the invasion of Iraq, and that was something that was not unique to Turkey by any means. The French shared it, the Germans shared it. Many parts of the world, U.S. allies were critical of that move, and in the wake of Iraq, the Iraq intervention, there was basically an egregious but stable regime was knocked out, and then a lot of mess ensued, right, in the region, and then the U.S. pulled out, and so in some ways, Turkey's been left to kind of deal with that mess, right, and so that's also another source of anti-Americanism, at least at the level of foreign policy. And so we see a lot of the concerns are kind of related to these episodes, right? The fact that the U.S. Supported the PYD in Syria, the Syrian Kurds, as our effective boots on the ground in the fight against ISIS, was interpreted in Turkey by many in Turkey through the prism of sort of a historical trauma about Western imperialists, empowering minorities to pull the country apart. And so in this sense, there's a lot of baggage to deal with. And all of this kind of came to a head with the attempted coup and the perception that, the US and EU leaders really kind of hedged in the response and waited to see who was going to come out ahead. When, by way of contrast, Moscow and Tehran, came out sort of unambiguously in favor of the elected government on that fateful evening. And so there's a lot of the baggage there, but there's also a lot of pragmatism, and we saw that in engagement with the Trump administration, and the Ankara succeeded in getting quite a few asks out of the Trump administration. So I envisage the same sort of pragmatism will animate the spirit of engagement with Biden. Obviously there is that legacy of the souring of U.S.-Turkey relations in the last years of the Obama administration, which Biden will bring to the table. Is also likely to be more critical on the human rights front. So this is going to it's not going to be smooth going, smooth running, but at the same time, I imagine that just out of sort of sheer pragmatic necessity right now, Turkey's playing a very delicate balancing game with the sort of renewal of great power sort of rivalries in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Middle East more broadly, in the Caucasus. And so Turkey's not going to want to alienate the United States either. So I imagine there'll be some room for this cooperation on discrete areas where there's clear overlapping interest. And to the extent that it's possible to bracket the areas where there's clear divergence of perception, it may be possible to work together, but it's certainly not going to be a honeymoon.
Speaking, it doesn't seem like Turkey going by these results is really expecting a honeymoon with too many nations, considering. Another point in the survey was a section on what is called Sev syndrome, which suggests that Turkey is under threat from Europe, which is looking to divide it still even after World War I, or hostility to the United States. And no nation really ranks very highly in the minds of Turks as a friend beyond Azerbaijan. But how should we understand this sense of isolation internationally for many Turks? What's the best way to understand that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's, the historic term, the Sev syndrome, is named for this treaty, right, after World War I that the Allies imposed. They were victorious and they imposed it on the defeated Ottoman state. It really would have carved up the country into occupied zones that were going to be held by the British, the Greeks, the Italians, the French. There was going to be an independent Armenia. There was going to be an independent Kurdistan. And there was just going to be this rump state of sort of landlocked, inland plateau left for the people who were, who came to be called, the Turks, the Turkish-speaking peoples, and those who assimilated to the Turkish nation of Anatolia. So it was a really traumatic experience, and the whole sort of, nationalist movement coalesced around mobilizing against that treaty and defeating the lone occupying forces who engaged in combat, which were the Greeks, and they. And the Republic of Turkey was founded, and really was based on this desire to kind of leave behind this protracted experience of Ottoman decline, of territorial loss, and this kind of this sort of forward-looking ethos, based on according to the vision of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, looking, a non-irredentist vision, looking forward. That's been an important part of Turkey's political culture, this trauma of outside interference, and that people are trying to, this idea that, foreign powers are trying to break Turkey up. And it's been inculcated through the education system, through the media, through politicians' narratives, and it creates that sense of kind of isolation that the Turks have no friends but Turks, and this was probably in abeyance for a while, especially after 1999, when there was a big earthquake in Turkey and Greece, and they sent mutual help to each other, and that kind of helped people get over some of their fears about neighbors across the Aegean, and then the EU process opened up, and there was a whole sort of kind of exploration of some of these kind of connections across the former Ottoman space with other peoples, including non-Muslim or non-Turkish speaking peoples. But that kind of mood came to an end, especially after 2013, when there were the Gezi Park protests, and Turkey's leadership really kind of, went with the argument that these are being fomented by external forces. They're trying to, disrupt the country, and exacerbated, of course, after the coup attempt. That idea that there's enemies within and without. And so, one kind of upshot of this is that certain factions, especially within the military, the more kind of more nationalist or more Eurasianist faction is in the military, have had more of an opportunity to articulate their grand vision, or their strategic vision for Turkey. And that vision does involve support for ethnic breadth in Azerbaijan in the Caucasus and its, reconquest of Nagorno-Karabakh. It does involve kind of a doctrine of an expansive naval doctrine in this idea of Mavi Vatan, the sort of the blue homeland, that is, seeks to kind of assert Turkey's presence. This is distinct from Kemalist nationalism, which was not irredentist. This is a vision that seeks to kind of assert Turkey's presence and force and interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, vis-a-vis Cyprus and Greece, but also kind of, in frictious ways from the perspective of, say, Egypt or Israel. It involves, Turkey's, foreign policy activism when it comes to Libya, and so there is this pivot to kind of a sort of it's an aggressive defensive posture, steeped in some of the Sev logic, but instead of the sort of the 1920s, 1930s doctrine of, okay, everybody's out to get us, let's stay at home and build up our fortress at home. This is a more kind of expansive posture towards the region, but still steeped in that same sense that a Turk has no friend but a Turk. So it has been quite isolating in the foreign policy space, but it does have domestic dividends. It helps to achieve that rally around the flag effect. And it reflects as I said, the sort of geostrategic vision of a lot of the folks who are shaping foreign policy and military doctrine right now. And to be fair, it's also really a consequence of this strategic vacuum that we have in the Middle East, with the U.S. retrenching, with the EU navel gazing. The West has basically left Turkey to be some sort of a buffer zone between the instability, real and perceived, of the Middle East and Europe, and in this context, there's a lot of great power rivalries going on. Russia has a stake in this game. China has an increasing stake in this game. Iran, Saudi Arabia, different coalitions in the Middle East have stakes in this game, and so Turkey's playing the game.
In
a nutshell.
And they're playing it real well, and considering they're now at this point where they can reorient themselves from this more confrontational approach with their rivals, whether it's the U.S. or even Russia, who ranked second as their favorite friend, but still barely ahead of the U.S. on the favorability. So it does speak to the flexibility that Turkey's able to exhibit when needed.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that just if I may add one point on that, to the extent that we're seeing sort of echoes of kind of 19th century geopolitics playing out in the region, it's really important to remember that the Ottoman Empire, there's so much talk about how it declined and how it was, decrepit and etc. But it actually survived for over 100 years, playing a really kind of agile game of balancing diplomacy vis-a-vis multiple great powers who are operating in that space. And the ability to do so does have to do with the location, does have to do with sort of certain, organic overlapping interests with various, adjacent and regional powers. And so, I expect to see more of this sort of multi-pronged diplomacy, defensive or expansive, in the months and years ahead.
On the question of how to deal with some of this polarization, the German Marshall Fund's the head of their Ankara office, he said in a blog post with the think tank that there were two approaches to reducing this level of polarization in Turkey: one from the top and one from the bottom. And from the top, it was the government would willingly strengthen separation of powers, judicial independence, institutions. And then the bottom-up approach was empowering civil society and to, encourage the government to make these changes. But of course, there are difficulties and complications attached to both of these approaches. So, given the growing gaps between Turks and the risk that that kind of entails in the long run for the country, what do you think is the right approach to take on restoring trust inside the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't have to be an either or. Obviously, the government taking a more conciliatory approach would help. That doesn't seem to be entirely forthcoming. Instead, we're getting signals about intent to become even more involved in NGOs governance, and university governance. There's a big controversy right now about the appointment of an outside rector to one of Turkey's oldest public universities, most august public universities, Boğaziçi Üniversitesi. So it's the sort of more inclusive approach doesn't seem to be forthcoming at the moment in terms of depolarizing, and that in turn makes it harder for civil society to respond. But I think for starters, what the work that the GMF has done is so crucial in that they're trying to understand the problem, name the problem, put numbers behind, and the different modalities of polarization, break it down into sort of discrete categories, and that helps you kind of to pinpoint and articulate potential policies that can be pursued. Maybe not you can't reconcile the whole society overnight, but you can start to identify little pieces here and there, things that we've talked about, like unemployment and inflation and youth's prospects. Another thing that was in the survey that's really critical, I think, was there's widespread recognition that women's rights in Turkey and that violence against women has reached untenable levels. The First Lady just tweeted about this recently, about how disturbed she is by violence against women, and there's a lot of acrimony between different strands of women's activism in Turkey. But that's one site where I think you could find some cross-cutting agreement that what we have to do something to address this problem that is hurting all of us. And so my hope is, again, that by beginning to name it, by beginning to develop at least certain issue-based strategies, potentially trust could be could be cultivated, because it's really something that Turkey is a magnificent country. It's beautiful. It has incredibly dynamic and diverse people, and it's a country that doesn't deserve to be in this very fraught place that it seems to be in. And so my hope is that that the pressure on civil society will lessen, and that instead partnerships will be sought within civil society, between civil society and government, towards trying to overcome some of these differences, which as I noted, as recently as a decade ago, were in the process of being transcended. And again, back to that mini series, perhaps I'm placing way too much faith in this one cultural product, but it really did evoke a desire to understand the other, and the response, the overwhelming response that it got along those lines, suggests that there are resources for that, sociologically, intellectually, politically, in Turkey, and I hope that they will be pursued.
Nora, this was a topic I was really happy to discuss with you today. And at this rate, I'm going to have to watch Ethos on Netflix if I can find it.
It's so good. It's so good.
Thank you very much for
Really,
that
the acting, the script.
Well, I look forward to both
Excellent.
giving it a chance, and also to speaking to you again soon. I do hope that you can come back to Turkey abroad sometime soon.
Yes, I thank you for the opportunity to share thoughts on this, really important study. All of the hard work was done by those who did the survey.
No, Nora, I really appreciated your time today. My name is
Thank you
Nicholas.
so much. See you.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.